Well, greetings, friends. Welcome to a long-form interview, one more with the on the Danielle Smith Show. I am Danielle Smith, and I am so delighted to be having this conversation today. So many of you have asked me what I think about the various freedom movements out there, whether it's Take Back Alberta or the Alberta Prosperity Project, and there's a bunch of others. But one strategy that has emerged that I think has a real chance of changing Confederation and changing Alberta's relationship with the rest of the country is one that was written by Rob Anderson, Barry Cooper, and Derek Frum. And Rob has been doing a number of town halls. You've probably attended a couple. I know I've attended a couple, but so have a variety of other MLAs as well, to talk through the Free Alberta strategy. I wanted to make sure that you knew what it was and how he's pieced this together and some of the reasons he's pieced it together. But it would be a shot across the bow that Ottawa couldn't at all ignore. And joining me now to talk about the Free Alberta strategy is Rob Anderson, who is a lawyer with WKA Lawyers, but also he's one of the smartest policy minds that we have in Alberta. I had the pleasure of working with him as House Leader when we were together in the legislature under the Wild Rose banner. Rob Anderson, thank you so much for being with me today.
Oh, thanks for those kind words, Danielle. It's good to be here, and congratulations on your new show. You're doing a great job.
Well, I appreciate that. So first of all, tell me where the Free Alberta strategy came from, because I know that Barry Cooper has been frustrated for a very long time with Confederation. So I was interested to see that he is listed as a co-author on that report. And Derek Frum, of course, people will know from his Canadian Constitution Foundation days. He cares an awful lot about the Constitution and making sure that we're following it, although we're not doing a very good job of that lately. So tell me how it all came together.
Well, I think it stems from just a total level of frustration with the way that Alberta has been treated in Confederation, and just the feeling that what we're doing and what we've done over the last 20 years, 10, 20 years is just not working with regards to protecting our provincial rights and asserting ourselves on the national stage, and essentially just being left alone to run our economy, create jobs, make money, and do the things that we're very good at here in Alberta. But it's becoming increasingly clear that not only does Ottawa want to take a large piece of our wealth, which we've generally been okay with sacrificing. We complain about it. We've complained about we don't like it, but that has now turned into an existential threat from a federal government that isn't just content with taking the eggs from the golden goose, but actually killing the golden goose itself. And it's beyond belief. And so with the re-election of Justin Trudeau after yet another less finishing second in the popular vote, still winning, and just all the things that are happening with regards to the carbon tax Supreme Court case, with regards to having our essentially economic sanctions imposed upon us so that we cannot, by Ottawa, so that we cannot get our oil and gas outside of the province of Alberta. All of these things came together to say, look, we can't just do the Jason Kenney thing of writing terse letters to Ottawa saying how disappointed we are with them and putting up billboards and opening up offices in Ottawa. This is not working. We have to do something more, and it should not also be constitutional reform. That is something that just won't work in the context, because there's certain provinces like Quebec and the Maritimes that are just simply completely taking advantage of the situation, and they'll never agree to change the status quo because it benefits them so much. So we had to figure out a way to have a made in Alberta approach that we could do ourselves without the permission of Ottawa or other provinces. But all we need here to do it here is the permission of Albertans. And it's a way of asserting our provincial rights and our provincial autonomy while still staying within Canada.
Talk to me about, we're on the cusp of seeing a new leadership change at the federal level. And Pierre Poilievre is emerging, I think, as a bit of a favorite in Western Canada. I wonder what your perspective is on those years of Stephen Harper, because there was a very strong push up until he got elected in 2000, and I guess that was back in 2004. And he was even the author of a similar type of Free Alberta strategy. It was called the Firewall Letter at the time. I remember Western Standard at the time was under a different banner, a different management, but they were doing polls about how unhappy people were in Confederation. And then all of a sudden, Stephen Harper got elected, and it was like Albertans said, "Oh, our problems are all solved." So what do you think happened there? Did we overestimate how much Stephen Harper would be able to change on our behalf? Did we get apathetic unnecessarily? And what should we do this time if there is actually a change in government? Is that going to be enough to change government at the federal level again?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I want to preface, and I think you would agree. I want to preface it by saying that Stephen Harper is obviously an ally of Alberta, and he obviously cares about the city of Calgary, where he's from, and also the province of Alberta. And he was an ally to Alberta. So I don't want this to come off as harsh, thinking that he's the enemy or something. He's not. And neither were the federal Conservative Party during those years. They did some good things for the province. They certainly, I would say, stopped some of the poor federal liberal policies that were hurting the province during that time, or at least slowed them down. But to be clear, Stephen Harper needed to get to win seats in Ontario and Quebec to maintain his razor-thin majority government. That was the only path to power, and it's still the only path to power. So, I understand what Pierre Poilievre is saying. I like what he's saying about Western alienation. I like what he's saying about the energy sector. I like to think that with what's happened in Russia and people seeing just how important energy security is, and making the obvious connections between Alberta being the place where the Western world could get a lot of its energy security, I like to think that perhaps Pierre will be more successful than Stephen. He'll have a better climate with which to say we really do need to change the way that we deal with energy policy in this country if he's elected. However, his path to power still goes through Quebec and Ontario, and those provinces, not all Quebecers and Ontarians, but I would say that a sizable majority have shown time and again that they vote for parties that are very hostile to Alberta's oil and gas industry. And my worry is, and I think that it's a likelihood, is that Pierre will get into power with all the best intentions, much like Stephen Harper did, and then realize that he isn't able to do much without offending voters in the places that he needs most to maintain his power. And so that's why we need to stop relying. I'm not saying we shouldn't vote for and support good people at the federal level. Of course we should, that understand where we're coming from. And Pierre's a good Alberta boy originally, and it would be fantastic to have him there. But we cannot rely on the federal Conservative Party or federal politicians to make our own way and to protect our own provincial sovereignty. We have to do that independent of who's in Ottawa, whether it's a Conservative government or in most years, a Liberal government.
I like the way you use the term sovereignty, and I use the word autonomy as well, because it can mean different things to different people. And you talk about already seeing emerging groups that are at various levels of, let's call it, fed-upness. So why don't you tell me what you're seeing out there? Because I've been watching the Alberta Prosperity Project group, and I think they initially started off thinking that there might be an aptitude or a desire for a nation within a nation type of approach that we've heard Quebec talk about, that we've heard Scott Moe in Saskatchewan talk about. But I went to one of their meetings, and I can tell you, when Dennis Modry polled the crowd of whether they wanted that approach or if they wanted a Clarity Act referendum, the majority of the room was already into Clarity Act referendum. How are you seeing the division shape up, and where do you think Albertans are at generally?
It's a very good point. I think that, and I talk about this, or we talk about it, the authors of the Free Alberta Strategy talk about it in the paper, is that there's three groups, and some would say it's a third. I would say personally that it's about 20 to 25% of Albertans that are just fed up completely. They want to separate. They want to separate now, and they don't really care if it's going to be difficult, or that all the answers to the hundreds of questions that would entail are resolved. They just don't care. We've been so mistreated in Confederation by our own government that they want out. And so I'd say that's 20 to 25%. And I understand and very much respect where those folks are coming from. They just love their province. They love Alberta. They're great Albertans. And they just don't see a way out. They feel cornered and trapped within their own country. So I get it. and I really do understand where it's coming from, and it's a legitimate grievance. Then I'd say there's about I'd say 30 to 40% that are mostly on the far left of the spectrum, or the center left of the spectrum, that basically do not care what Canada does to us, or what I would say Ottawa does to us. It doesn't matter. They will continue to wave the flag and continue to take whatever Ottawa gives us or doesn't give us. And the country, they're Canadian, they're federalists first. They're Canadian first. And our grievances, though possibly important, and we can raise them, as Rachel Notley has raised them in the past as well, it's never justified to even think about leaving the country or changing the federal-provincial relationship in any way. So that's 34%, 30 or 40%. Then I think there's a remaining 30%, 35%, maybe 40%, that are in the middle, that say, you know what, what's happened now, what's been happening is unacceptable. We cannot continue to do what we've been doing. It's not working at all. We're not going to continue to take it, but we don't want to, and we don't think it's the right time to move to a vote on separation, or to separate, because A, we're not ready. B, we've really done nothing to assert our provincial sovereignty within Canada, nothing of any import anyway. And we need to have a strategy to do that, and really go down that road as Quebec did, to see if we can carve out a fair and equitable place in this confederation before we vote on pulling the plug completely.
Okay, so I kind of look at it almost like a ReFederation strategy, potentially, just sort of setting different terms for how we're going to relate with the rest of the country. Is that an accurate way of looking at it, or do you think that would be one of the possible outcomes?
I absolutely think that'd be one of the possible outcomes. I think the strategy doesn't ask Ottawa for permission, obviously, to do these things. But if every province did what is in the Free Alberta Strategy for their own province, it would be a refederation. It would cause a refederation to occur along very different lines. And I think it's fair to say that not just Alberta, but I'd say British Columbia, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Ontario for sure, if we were negotiating confederation today, there is no way in hell that Alberta would agree to the terms that it lives under today in confederation. And I don't think if BC, Saskatchewan, no brainer, wouldn't either. But BC, Manitoba, Ontario, if they're being honest, I don't think that they would join under those circumstances either. I don't even know if Quebec would. Financially, they're doing well, but I don't think they appreciate some of the intrusions into their provincial sovereignty as well. So why wait for Ottawa to give up power? Ottawa's never going to give up power voluntarily. They never will. That's not how power works. That's not how politics works. You know that. It's so hard for institutions, bureaucracies, politicians to give up power, especially when they have the inertia of a federal government. It's so massive. But if the provinces decide to, no, we're not going to ask permission, we're just going to govern ourselves, have ourselves be a nation within a nation, much like Quebec has done, there's nothing really Ottawa can do about it. And that's what the strategy hopes
Well,
to do.
and I want to go through it because, I went to an event over the past week, and I was talking about some of the stats that you have put into your slide presentation. And a woman came up to me and said, people need to know. They need to know how much more money goes to Ottawa than comes back in federal transfers. And I always thought, you mean people don't know? Well, maybe they don't. So let me pull up your PowerPoint, and I'll let you talk about some of the items that you've got in here, just so that we can establish a baseline of knowledge in case people are unaware of just how imbalanced Confederation has become and just how beleaguered we have become as well. And I take your point too, because I used to say when I was campaigning and doing town halls that I think people can be supportive of the idea of supporting our friends and neighbors so that they can have roughly equivalent programs for roughly equivalent tax rates. But that's not what's happening anymore. This has turned into a massive tax and transfer scheme that benefits largely one of our largest and most populous, and now one of our wealthiest provinces, which is Quebec. So I want people to see some of the baseline for that. So what are you showing us here with this first table?
Let me back up here to this chart, and I would just say that we all remember when Alberta was, I would say, the most economically prosperous jurisdiction in North America, perhaps in the Western world for a time. And the Alberta Advantage, Ralph Klein holding the debt paid in full sign, the whole bit, everything that went along with that, the full employment. Everybody who wanted a job not only could get a job, but could get a rather well-paying job, regardless of what their education level was. And if you had an education, wow, the world was your oyster here. So what happened? We went from surpluses to and balanced budgets and no debt to right now we have $100 billion in debt. I mean, the debt that Ralph Klein had to pay off over the 15, 16 years that he was premier was about 24, I think it was 23 or $24 billion. Well, now we have $100 billion to pay off. So what occurred? Well, look at the next chart. Here it is. People say, well, what happened there? Well, there are two main things. One is the attacks on our oil and gas sector, and we'll get to that. But
let me describe what I'm seeing here, just in case
Sure.
anyone's listening to this just on audio podcast alone. When I'm looking at the total net contribution of Alberta, it's in 2017 dollars. So you've adjusted for inflation. It's really interesting to see all through the 1960s, barely a blip. And then I think we ended up with Lougheed getting elected in 71. And that's when we started seeing the net transfer out of Alberta. It looked like it kind of peaked out at that time in the 1980s and then dropped off again in the early part of the 90s. But holy Dinah, what happened in post 2000? It's just grown in an extraordinary way. It looks like it peaked out almost $30 billion in net transfers out of our province sometime around the 2014, 2015 mark. That's extraordinary.
Oh, absolutely. And it's inflation adjusted. So that, these aren't skewed numbers. The crazy thing about it is that after 2006, where you see it go from 10 to 15 to 20 to 30, 25 to 30, etc., those weren't, like, a lot of those years we weren't doing well. I mean, in fact, in 2019, Quebec posted I believe it was a $4 billion surplus, and they were saying how wonderful that was, and just look what we've been able to achieve with our great management of our money. Well, but in that same year, Alberta sent $20 billion in equalization, most of which went to Quebec. And when I say equalization, what I mean is net, the amount that Alberta taxpayers pay to the federal government over and above what they receive back in transfer payments, grants, subsidies, so forth. It's a monstrous number, $20 billion a year in 2019, as you can see. And that was the same year that we ran an almost $10 billion deficit. So we're literally not only can we not balance our own books, we're literally paying to balance Quebec's books because.
And I agree with you. Before you go any further, though, I'm looking at this, and it goes back to our earlier conversation about Stephen Harper. It looks like this escalation happened during a period of time when we thought we had an ally for Alberta in Confederation. And maybe that's the case, is that we did do well. We ended up having a high level of workforce participation. Lots of people were making money. We had lots of corporations paying taxes. But what that meant is that there was a whole lot more money going to Ottawa. You would have thought that would have been the time to try to get a new relationship with Ottawa to make sure that some of those dollars came back here.
No, Stephen Harper found out what every other federal politician finds out, is that if you want to get elected in Quebec and Ontario, you better pony up. And where do you get the money? Well, there's this beautiful money producing machine out west, and you can get it from Alberta and Saskatchewan, and that's what occurred. And now, the only issue is we'll get to, is now it's not just about getting the money out of here. It's become, we've got to shut it down for various environmental reasons. So it's man, we are getting it. But that's one of the real, I would say, people say, it's the reason we have these large deficits in Alberta, not this year because of gas prices, but in prior oil and gas prices, but in past, is because of provincial spending habits. We spend too much, and that's true. The provincial government in past has spent too much, and it has outstripped population and inflation growth. But that is not the only reason. The larger reason is that we have a giant sucking sound coming out of Ottawa to the tune of $20 to $30 billion a year, and we just cannot sustain that over the long term.
You know, I interrupted one point you were making about Quebec because it's quite interesting that Quebec's fortunes, just as ours have gone down because of these massive deficits and the debt that we've run up, they're doing pretty well, better than ever than they
Oh
have
yeah.
in recent years, haven't they?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and they get it's very asymmetrical confederate. It's very asymmetrical confederation because, for example, just I'll give you an example of how this works. Daycare in Quebec, daycare, they basically already had a $5 a day daycare that they were being subsidized for. Well, now you have a new, and that was coming out of these transfers that you're seeing here. Well, now we have a new program, and Alberta only is going to be subsidized to the tune that they comply with the federal government, what they want with regards to the regulation of daycare pricing in this province and so forth. It's very tightly regulated, tightly controlled. There's a provincial federal agreement that had to be in place, kind of almost at gunpoint to get some of these federal monies. Meanwhile, not only did Quebec was already being subsidized for $5 a day daycare before this new program, now they just, so because they were already at $5 a day, the government said, okay, well, here's just an envelope of money. Here's your per capita share of the money. You don't have to change anything. You were already getting subsidized for $5 a day daycare, but here you go. Here's just a wad of cash. Do what you want with it. Okay, well, what are you going to do with it? If you're the provincial government, you just put it in the coffers, help balance the budget, or subsidize whatever you want to subsidize to buy votes in your province. It's an absolutely absurd system, and we do that in so many areas of the federal budget. We find ways, or the Ottawa finds ways to subsidize Quebec,
Yeah.
to buy votes there, and not send those same subsidies over to Alberta and BC and Saskatchewan.
Well, the sad part is that this chart shows that it doesn't matter whether it's a liberal or a
No.
conservative in Ottawa. It's the same story, unfortunately. Show us a couple of more slides to just give us the full context of what we're dealing with here as well.
Yeah, well, and this is one that a lot of people comment on. You think that 10-year period, and you remember the last slide. Well, $240 billion went out. We're literally, even though we're not the largest province, we are by far the largest contributor to equalization in the province. So 240 billion over 12 years. I mean, could you imagine what that? We wouldn't have $100 billion. If you want to put it in perspective, that $240 billion would pay for our entire provincial debt right now, gone. And we'd still have $140 billion left over to put in the Heritage Fund, or lower taxes, or invest in healthcare or education. I mean, that's several times more than the provincial budget on the entire provincial budget annually, gone out of Alberta taxpayer pockets. So this isn't small change, and it has real consequences to our healthcare system, to our competitiveness, to really everything in our economy.
It's an enormous number, especially since we know that it has been such a hard time since 2014, and yet the transfers keep on going. What's your next slide?
Yeah, per capita. Some people say, okay, well, per capita, where are we at? Well, it actually, even the picture even gets worse from the last slide. Every single man, woman, and child in the province is providing roughly, well, depending on the year, between $4,000 and $6,000 in equalization to Quebec, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, PI, etc. I mean, just again, the reason that this is a good chart is because, or a good illustration, is because people can understand what $5,000 is, and it's hard to understand sometimes with 240 billion. What does that mean? Well, could you imagine every year if a family of four had an extra $20,000 in their pocket that they weren't paying in taxes, or that they were receiving back in provincial services, whether that be reduced tuition for their kids, whether that be smaller classroom sizes, more access to healthcare, more competitive tax rates for their business. I mean, you can just go on and on and on. It makes a big, big difference. And yet we don't, obviously we don't see that benefit.
You know what strikes me as well is that we know that British Columbia and most years Saskatchewan, but more recently it's been Saskatchewan and Ontario also pay more into Confederation than they get back. But when you look at those numbers, it's actually fairly modest. It looks like it's far less than $500 per person. And I think that that's more the level that I would expect an equalization program to provide. It's such an outlier that Albertans end up paying so much more per person.
No, it is. And if it was, it's funny, this can skew things a little bit because you look at the the Maritimes and Newfoundland, and of course they're receiving a lot of equalization. But I don't think people have a real problem with that because they understand that those provinces don't have the economies of scale that we have in the larger provinces. But honestly, Quebec, honestly, they're a massive province with a very, very mature economy, very diverse economy, unlimited hydro. They have virtually no energy concerns with regards to producing electricity there. And yet they are living on the dole. I mean, this is incredible. I mean, that's not, like you say, that's not what equalization was for. It was to help New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, PI, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba in lead time, some of these smaller provinces, to get on their feet and to be able to afford some of the same services that we can in these larger provinces. It's not for Quebec.
I'm surprised that British Columbia isn't more upset about this too, because they have a population of only around, I think, 5.5 million people. I think Quebec is in the order of more like 8.5 million. We're 4.5 million, and yet it's stunning to me that we would expect small provinces to pony up to pay for a larger province. I don't even know how it came to be the case. That it should have been that Ontario and Quebec, as our two most populous provinces, should have never been able to qualify for equalization. It's remarkable to me that we didn't have that worked into the program.
Totally. And then, as you know, ideally the program would have said, okay, once BC and Alberta became large enough, they wouldn't qualify just on a population basis. And again, you would decrease the amount of provinces that were, using it. That should have been the whole point. But yeah, it hasn't turned. It's a giant vote buying scheme now.
All right, let's go to the next slide.
That. So we've kind of covered some of these things, so I won't spend too much time. We talked about the budget surplus versus our deficit, the cheap tuition, daycare, and all these other things. But we've talked about this too. But again, I think the big difference between Trudeau Sr. People think Trudeau Sr. was all about destroying the oil and gas industry. It's interesting, when I started this process, I realized that was kind of one of the what do you call it? The lore, the legend.
One of the foundational beliefs of anyone who grew up during the NEP.
That's right, exactly, precisely. But that's actually not true. He did not want to destroy the oil and gas industry. He wanted to control it. And as many socialists have found out over the years, when you try to control something that should be run by the free market with regulation and red tape and subsidies and allocating capital in ways that it shouldn't, in ways that it shouldn't be allocated, what happens is you end up with unintended consequences, and you hurt the very industry that you're trying to grow and control. And that's what happened. The NEP was a terrible policy, a terrible set of policies, and it harmed the energy industry a great deal. But it was never meant to destroy the energy industry. It was meant to give Mr. Trudeau and the federal government more control and power over the energy industry. Trudeau Jr., on the other hand, very simple. He is, I would say, he is a. I'd say he's a religious fanatic. He believes in this eco religion, this green religion, to the point that he believes that he needs to destroy or shut down his own country's largest and most important industry. Literally create, it's, economically suicidal, frankly, for a country to do that. And that's what he's doing. And he does it because he believes, maybe he honestly believes it. I don't know. He's not a terribly bright individual, but perhaps he believes it, that this is his way of trying to save the world. And he's been very clear about it. It's part of his Great Reset, the UN's Great Reset agenda. He's been, it's not like he's been hiding that. And he wants to contribute to that. So his stated goal is not to control the oil and gas industry, although he wants to suck it as dry as much as he can while it's on its way out. But he wants to phase out and eliminate Alberta's oil and gas industry and Saskatchewan's and so forth.
So just going into the Great Reset a little bit more, because people are always concerned about the World Economic Forum and what their plans are with stakeholder capitalism. You think that that's what is embedded in their strategy, is the complete end to the use of fossil fuels? Yeah,
I believe so. I think that they've made that clear. If you go on to the World Economic Forum and you look at the the 2030 agenda, Agenda 2030, if you look at it, it says right there is to eliminate the use of fossil fuels. Now, obviously, it's a matter of degrees. Some want to phase it out over 20, 30 years. Some want to phase it over 2 or 3 years. Some crazy people want to do it right away. They have no idea what that would mean. But anyway, But that's their goal. And I think it's just almost like a religious belief. It's almost like, when what we saw with COVID here recently, where people get down a track and they kind of forge it into their belief system that this is the righteous and the right thing to do based on the initial information that they received from their, third grade science teacher or whoever. And they just can't pivot. They can't receive more information, analyze it, and say, you know what? The first information I got here was incomplete, or heaven forbid, wrong. I need to pivot and change. And the UN and some of these large organizations that have been built based on this green religion, and the amount of money that they get from industry and the amount of money that they get from the nonprofit sector, it's literally like its own country. It's just so large, and there's so many people employed in it and have vested interests in it. And so they just refuse to pivot. And they've been advocating the end of fossil fuel use for decades and decades now. They've built entire cottage industries around it and businesses around it, and they're not going to change their minds. It is still what they want to do. And unfortunately, the UN has been caught up in that for a while. And part of that is because they want to manage, they want to govern in an unelected fashion. They want to govern the way that we are able to allocate capital and so forth. They want to redistribute wealth between poor countries and richer countries. And that means they need more control mechanisms in order to do that. And one of the ways that they want to do that is by taking a lot of the wealth out of these wealthy nations that produce a lot of these products, and be able to switch it over and transfer it over to other places.
Well, you've done something I didn't think you'd ever be able to do. You're probably making people pine for the elder Trudeau as opposed to Trudeau the Junior, because there used to be a bit more of a pragmatism, at least with Liberals. And I think that we've seen that before with Liberals like Paul Martin and John Manley and Frank McKenna and even Dan McTeague. I mean, there is this, I think there is an emerging pragmatism as people see that wind and solar and battery power aren't the only answers. But are you seeing much evidence that the Justin Trudeau and Jagmeet Singh alliance will acknowledge that?
Well, I think first off, Justin Trudeau is not a typical liberal, federal liberal. He, in my view, he's the first NDP prime minister that Canada's ever had. I mean, he is a full-on left-wing socialist, and he's got that dictatorial streak, as we saw with the Emergencies Act and during the trucker convoy, and also during COVID. He wants control and to get as much control into the federal government as possible. That's just who he is. So yeah, I mean, I miss the days of. I mean, I've never been a fan of the federal Liberal Party, but as you say, I mean, it's you used to. It was almost like the Democrats and the Republicans in the states. There were enough moderates in each party that the two parties could often work together and get things done that made sense for the country, regardless whether that was dealing with the deficit at one time or energy policy and so forth. Canada's been the same way over the years, where the federal Conservatives and Liberals, frankly, working together, have been able to help create a situation where we had one of the most powerful Western economies in the world, one of the most powerful economies in the world for a period of time. Our energy industry was second to none. We were doing things with technology and advances in technology, environmental sciences, and so forth here that weren't being done anywhere else in the world, and we were doing it ethically and cleanly. But we've gone off the rails, and you've got now the people in charge that used to be what we would consider the very fringe, Elizabeth May, Elizabeth Warren group. They're the ones that are now in charge. So the adults are just not running things anymore, and it's sad to see.
Okay, let's. I don't want to miss out on any of, because you've got such great graphics in your presentation. If there are others that you want to show us, I want to make sure that we can get to that before we start going through the strategy itself, because you're making a really compelling case that the status quo is just not something we can put up with anymore. It keeps getting worse and worse. And we know that we're seeing additional new programs. You've mentioned childcare. They've talked about trying to bring in a new pharmacare program, a new long-term care national program, a new dentistry program. All that means is more expensive federal programs that Alberta is going to pay disproportionately for. And when I've said that that before. I didn't have the data in front of me to prove it. You just put the data in front of us to prove it. There is no advantage to Alberta of underwriting yet another federal program.
No, and it's even worse than that. That's a huge issue. But the other issue is that we're giving up sovereignty over how those dollars are spent. So for the daycare is a good example. We have a very, full disclosure, I'm involved in that industry, but we have a very good childcare industry childcare provision industry in Alberta. It's run by the free market for the most part. There's some nonprofits, but it's very much a for-profit sector. But if you compare the results with regards to early childhood development and the quality of care and the fact that there's never shortages until recently, because of this new program, all of those things were things that Alberta and BC and Saskatchewan could have been very proud of. But now, in order to qualify for these federal dollars, we have to, frankly, there's going to be caps on how many private providers there can be. So how many new spaces private providers can provide or can grow. And so you've got right now already daycares that once had no wait lists and we're trying to fill and competing and lowering their prices in order to compete and so forth. Now you've got every major daycare in the province with 500, 600, 700 people, kids on the wait list because no one can build new spots because they don't qualify to build new spots under this because they're not a nonprofit.
That's what I heard, is that part of the condition of getting that $2.8 billion, that I guess, they claw it away and then they parse it back to us. And the conditions were that 10,000 new spaces had to be not-for-profit. I'm hearing that there are private daycare operators who were in the middle of doing a major expansion and now being told they can't accept more kids. There are other operators and a lot of women business owners and women in various cultural communities as well, now converting to nonprofits just so that they can continue to expand their spaces. Why would we agree to something like this? I mean, that's the thing that is one thing to get the money back, but what's the point in getting money back if it's going to cost you more and you have to give up all your principles and values for how you want to run your system?
Exactly. And that will happen with pharmacare. That'll happen with dentists. That'll happen with everything the federal government touches. It's already happened with healthcare. The Canada Health Act restricts, if we want the Canada Health transfer, we have to abide by the principles of the Canada Health Act. And that has restricted innovation in healthcare for decades and decades. We are so behind because of that legislation. And that is going to happen with everything that the federal government touches. So one thing that we don't talk about in the strategy, but one thing as a lawyer I've thought about a lot is somebody needs to make a constitutional challenge on things like, for example, any strings attached funding for a program that is clearly of a provincial in nature. So the daycare would be an example. That's daycare, childcare services. That's provincial in nature. It's clear it's provincial. There's no argument about that. What right the federal government, I think, will be allowed by a court to say, okay, we can give money to provinces for healthcare and for these other things, but do they have a constitutional right to attach strings to that funding? No one has ever brought that through to the Supreme Court level or a reference question and said, how can they do that? They can give the money, fine, give us the money. But just like Quebec gets the bundle, the envelope of money for the new childcare program without any strings attached, shouldn't that be the case with Alberta, Saskatchewan, BC? It should. And I think the same thing would apply for healthcare. If you're going to, that's a provincial jurisdiction. If the federal government's going to interfere or is going to fund that, fine, but you do it per capita and there's no strings attached. There's no Canada Health Act saying what you can and can't do in running your healthcare system. No one's tried that. No.
I'd love to see us try that. So let's talk about this slide that you've got up, because I've left you put it up there, and I'm sure people have steam coming out of their ears as they look at Stephen Guilbeault. But he said, we've made a commitment in Canada to eliminate fossil fuel electricity production by 2030. What in the world is he talking about? That is clearly an area of provincial jurisdiction. it's the provinces who determine what our electricity generation is going to be. We've already done a major transformation over to natural gas and done it earlier than what the initial parameters were. Initially, we were going to phase out by 2030, but the companies did such a great job of phasing it out early. So how in the world is this going to be enforced? What does he think is going to emerge by 2030 that we can eliminate 90% of our electricity production? And how does he even have the power to enforce that?
Well, very good questions. And no one knows this issue, frankly, better than you, Danielle. I've heard you speak for hours and hours on this, on energy policy in this way, and from everything from net zero to some of the technologies that we're using in Alberta. So you've done a lot of work on this, but you're absolutely right. This is not possible, and this comes from the perspective of a Quebecer that of course Quebec receives 95% of its electricity from hydro. In Alberta, we get 90% of our electricity from burning fossil fuels, mostly natural gas, more and more natural gas over time, and still obviously a lot of coal as well. So that's just the situation. And we've just been through winter. We're just kind of popping our heads out, looking outside, thinking spring's here. But could you imagine going through a winter in this province without natural gas and coal? I mean, the only substitute for it here, it's not hydro, there's not enough, and the cost would be unbelievable. There's nuclear, but that takes years, decades to build that up, and the cost is unbelievable, of course. And it's not going to be done by 2030, that's for sure. And then, of course, there's other issues involved with that. Or I guess we could wallpaper our whole landscape with solar panels and windmills. Like just block out the mountains entirely, and then still only get 10% of the way there.
And you're not even kidding when you say that, because I was just down in Crow's Nest Pass, and you need an awful lot of turbines on an awful lot of landscape in order to generate a fraction of the power that we get from those other types of resources. And I was even told that sometimes the wind blows so hard down there that they have to turn the turbines down because they can't accommodate all of the wind. And then there's times it doesn't blow at all. So I have to wonder what the strategy is here. But again, it's just another example that these edicts come from politicians in Quebec that have huge implications for our province, and we're all just going along as if they're not serious. I think they're deadly serious, and I think if we don't do something to push back, that they're going to presume that they can actually implement this policy.
Yeah, and they're going to try, and that's what the next slide's about. If you want to go to that, this is because you said, how are they going to enforce it? Well, they're going to have emissions caps. They're going to bring those types of things, and you'll see them more and more. The federal fuel standards, which are really just another carbon tax, frankly. But then you have the main carbon tax, and of course the insanity of where we are right now at $50. It was just increased recently under that Singh-Trudeau alliance there. People are all, of course, concerned right now with inflation. And as you know, Danielle, the number one reason, I don't want to say the number one reason, but there's two main reasons. One is federal monetary policy. We just keep printing money for an unsustainable debt, and that's flooding the money supply. And of course, that causes inflation. But the other major reason why Canada is having its worst inflation in decades is because of the carbon tax. It's just costs and all the other regulations that are causing energy prices to rise. Because when energy prices rise, as everyone knows, or everyone should know, that means the cost of transportation rises, the cost of production rises, everything goes up. Food, clothing, everything. And that's what's happening. And so it's $50 now. Could you imagine inflation at $170 a ton? And that's by 2030. That's Mr. Guilbeault's big number. 2030, we're going to eliminate all fossil fuels. Well, he wants to do it so that by making energy, essentially fossil fuel energy, completely unaffordable. But of course, he's going to make living completely unaffordable for all Canadians, but especially in Alberta.
Okay, you're giving us lots of anxiety now, so we better get on to some solutions here.
Yeah, we should. You're right. I won't spend too much on this because this one just makes my blood pressure go. But if the oil tanker ban applies to our side of the continent, but not to the Quebec side of the continent, of course. The no new pipelines legislation. You go down the list. Keystone, Energy East. All of these things have been shut down for various reasons by the federal Liberal party, or giving assist to the Biden administration in the Keystone's case. But the point is that I think I'm going to change this slide in the future to not say a tax on Alberta. I'm going to call it economic sanctions. What else do you call this? Like, what do
It
you
is
call?
economic sanctions. It's so interesting, isn't it? How hard it is to get through an approval process to get anything built, and yet how easy it is for them to cancel projects
Yeah,
and send in
no,
the way.
no, absolutely. I mean, it's economic sanctions. If you did this to a country, if you did this to Russia, Russia would call it economic sanctions.
Hmm.
If you did it to any country, they would call it economic sanctions. And what's so unbelievable is this is the only economic sanctions these are the only economic sanctions that I'm aware of in the world where it's a federal government sanctioning their own country from being able to produce and export their most important, most valuable resource to all of the world, even though there's a massive demand for it everywhere, especially now with what's going on in Russia. So
Yeah.
we have economic sanctions imposed on our province by our own federal government, and the result has been hundreds of billions of dollars in investment lost. We've seen it over and over again. Projects lost. The current projects, Suncor, Syncrude, they'll stay in place. They'll run their lives out. They wanted to expand, by the way, and of course, doesn't look like that'll be allowed by Mr. Guilbeault either. From what
I remember that story at the same time as he's approving a new offshore oil project in Newfoundland and Labrador. He's writing a note to Suncor, which incidentally has a net zero strategy along with all of those others in that Pathways project because they want to capture the CO2 and bury it in some of the salt caverns, I guess, and pore space in the Cold Lake area. And so even though they have a net zero strategy saying, no, don't think it's going to match our net zero plan. It's almost like the energy companies are doing everything the government tells them to do. And still the answer is no.
Well, they're located in Alberta, unfortunately. And that's, I mean, I just got to say it. We have an anti-Alberta, I don't want to use the B word, BIGOT, but boy, you'd swear with some of the things he says and some of the decisions they make that they certainly don't like Alberta very much. You wanted to talk about good news, so
yes, let's talk about it.
Okay, so the Free Alberta Strategy, and you've obviously introduced a lot. Our mission is pretty simple and straightforward. We believe the strategy will it's to make Alberta a sovereign jurisdiction within Canada. And federal equalization and invest those dollars in healthcare, education, diversification efforts, and of course, complete and total free world market access for our energy resources. So that's our mission. The strategy is based on there's several. It's a series of proposals that we are asking the provincial government, not the federal government, the provincial government in Edmonton, to pass into law, to implement into practice, that we think will allow Alberta to govern itself more completely and to assert our sovereignty over our natural resources and over our own governance. And there's two foundational pieces of legislation for that. The first is the Alberta Sovereignty Act. And this is, in my view, the most important part of the Free Alberta Strategy. It's the line in the sand. And it's funny, our members are getting it. We have an email list of roughly 100,000 people that we send out our information to that have signed up in various ways to hear about the Free Alberta Strategy. And we polled them recently. We said, what part of the Free Alberta Strategy, because we want to focus on, kind of narrow our focus to one or two things here instead of the entire strategy as we have the first 6 months as we've introduced it to Albertans. And we thought maybe it would be the police force or the pension plan or something.
Or my personal favorite, collecting personal income taxes.
Yeah, a great one that is. I love it. But surprisingly, 70% came back overwhelmingly for the Alberta Sovereignty Act, and the reason is because it really is our line in the sand. It's kind of like a notwithstanding clause for provincial rights, and you have. Of course, the notwithstanding clause allows the province to not enforce, with regards if it's a charter issue. So if there's a law that the Supreme Court says violates the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, so right to liberty and all those religions, so forth. If there's a law that the SCC says violates that, then the province can say, notwithstanding the Supreme Court's decision on that, we are going to opt out. Notwithstanding that, we are going to still enforce this law in our province, or still not enforce this law in our province if it's in the reverse and it's a federal law that's trying to impose it on the province. So they can do that, with the notwithstanding clause. What this does is, but that only applies to charter issues. It doesn't apply to provincial rights. And the Alberta Sovereignty Act, just what it does is it gives the provincial government, the provincial legislature, authority to invoke it and essentially not enforce a piece of federal legislation or a ruling that that the provincial legislature feels is in breach of its provincial authorities or is just an unfair attack on the rights of Albertans.
I love the way you've explained that, because people have asked me before, can't we use the notwithstanding clause to stop that no more pipelines law, or to stop that tanker ban, or to stop their interference with using all kinds of environmental rules to shut down our natural resources projects? And this is the equivalent of that. And so I love where you're going with it. Now the question is, you have a legal background.
Mhm.
How would the courts adjudicate that? If we invoke the act, so we pass the act, and then we invoke it to say, you know what, that tech frontier mine that we couldn't get to square one on, we've decided to revisit that project and we're going to approve it. Would we be able to go ahead and do that, or would that have to be litigated for the next 10 years to figure out if we had the right to make the approvals?
Great question, and the answer to that is that there's no doubt that this would be there would be a charter challenge, almost certainly not charter, sorry, a constitutional challenge by the federal government to say that invoking the Alberta Sovereignty Act to not enforce a federal law in that province, like for example the carbon tax. If we just said we're not going to use any provincial agency whatsoever to enforce the carbon tax, and we'll even go further than that, we will not license any business that charges the carbon tax within the province of Alberta. If we did something like that, of course, the federal government's going to run off to their friends at the Supreme Court and try to provide a reference to them saying we need to find this unconstitutional. But the question is, and so that's when it's going to come down to leadership. You'd have what's called a constitutional crisis, because you would have the province saying, we are sovereign, and because we have all the rights of enforcement under the Constitution, and we have rights over healthcare and so forth, we're sovereign and we can make this choice, and we have decided to give ourselves this power, and we are the sovereign power over this jurisdiction here in Alberta, these boundaries. And then you'd have the federal government say, no, that's not the case. And you'd have your constitution, and you'd have maybe the Supreme Court agreeing with them, and the province saying, we don't really care, we're going to do it anyway. And so there you have your constitutional crisis. And what's so great about that is it would create a leverage point for our province, and hopefully other provinces that would join us, to rewrite the deal, not rewrite the deal, frankly, get back to what the deal was before it's been altered, kind of like Darth Vader on Star Wars. I'm altering the deal, pray I do not alter it any further. Anyway.
Well, here's the interesting thing before we get on to some of these other ones, because they'll sound a little bit more familiar, I think, to folks, because I think some of them have been proposed in the past with the firewall letter. But I remember Drew Barnes just last week put forward a motion saying that the legislature pledges to use all means, legal, political, constitution to assert our sovereignty or our rights in Confederation. And I think he even used the language that Premier Kenney had used in the past. Now, have you talked to Premier Kenney, or has he shown an interest in your Alberta Sovereignty Act? Because that seems to be a pretty elegant way of passing a piece of legislation that would allow us to fight back on a number of fronts.
Yeah, we've written him. He's shown no interest whatsoever. We've had lots of interest from his caucus, though. Lots of MLAs have reached out to talk about it. We've had, I believe, over 10 now. I think it's 11 that have actually appeared on the town halls. And then I've talked with probably a dozen, at least more, about the strategy, and who are, I would say, quietly supportive and just trying to maybe find their voice a little bit on it. But
maybe a voice found after May the 18th. I guess we'll see how that one goes. Let's talk about some of these other proposals that you've got, though, for the Free Alberta Strategy.
No, for sure. And it goes back to enforcement. You know what I said earlier about what if the federal government doesn't support this and it's found unconstitutional by the Supreme Court? Well, that's why people need to understand the reason why we can do this is that enforcement is king. If you have a law, but you don't have enforcement, and you don't have the right to enforce it, then the law really means nothing. The court decision really means nothing if it's not enforced, obviously. So the great thing about the provinces is that, or the provinces across the country, including Alberta, is that we have almost all of the enforcement mechanisms under our area of jurisdiction. So policing, classic example. We should not, one of the proposals is, of course, and that's part of the firewall letter too before it, is to have our own Alberta police, provincial police force that is accountable to the provincial government as opposed to the government in Ottawa. The municipal police forces are already provincially governed. So if you have a law, for example, if the federal government says we need to shut down the tech mine, whatever, from expanding, or the Syncrude or the Suncor mine from expanding, we need to shut that down because we're not allowing it. But they don't have a police force because we've invoked the Alberta Sovereignty Act, and the police force is bound to follow that within the province of Alberta. How are you going to shut it down? Right? You're not. And that's the point, is that they can't enforce it. And that's the same with regards to property. The great thing is that we already enforce, we already handle all enforcement against land, personal property, civil enforcement, bailiffs, all that stuff, garnishment, all that stuff is all provincially governed. People don't know this, but we actually run, the province actually runs the courts. It's not, people think, oh, it's the feds run the courts. No, not at all. They appoint some of the judges, some of the Queen's Bench judges or the Queen's Bench judges are appointed federally for sure. The provincial ones are provincially appointed. But the actual courts themselves, the actual clerks that provide the filed orders and the filed judgments and run the court system, that's all provincially governed. So, and controlled. So the point is that we have a massive amount of options. And so rather than, we can talk about how we would not enforce the carbon tax or not enforce the Emergencies Act and so forth. Every law is going to be a little bit different, but the point is the province has a massive amount of enforcement power. And if we choose not to enforce something like Quebec has done in the past, it's not enforceable here. And we need to maybe do first and ask forgiveness later, if that makes sense.
What it does. And what I'm interested in your thoughts on, especially you wrote this strategy before the Emergency Act was used to freeze bank accounts. And it's got me thinking, after the federal government used the power that way, maybe I should be opening up an account at ATB or one of the credit unions. How do you envision us being able to use our authority over that aspect of the banking system to assert our sovereignty? Have you given some, it looks like you've given some thought to that. And I don't know if any of your views have changed now that you've seen how the federal government has been able to wield their power. Does that make that more urgent?
I do think it's urgent, and I think that we need to bring together some of the best financial minds in the province together to see the viability of an independent provincial banking system for that reason. And I gotta say, I gotta give it to Quebec though. Like, wasn't it wonderful to see the day after that Justin Trudeau invoked the Emergencies Act? What does Quebec do the day after? They immediately call their National Assembly, which they believe has, and which they assert in their provincial constitution has sovereignty over all the affairs in Quebec. It supersedes the federal government according to them. And they pass a motion that says we will not enforce the Emergencies Act within the province of Quebec. Now, the federal government could have, gone to court and said, well, technically under the Constitution, yada, 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 yada. But guess what? The province of Quebec they don't care. They just say, look, we're sovereign. And if that is an attack on our sovereignty, we may even agree with Justin Trudeau on what he's trying to achieve with regards to getting those protesters out of Ottawa. However, we will not have the Emergencies Act, which is in police enforcement and freezing of bank accounts over personal property and so forth. We will not have our provincial sovereignty usurped by the federal government. Why is Alberta not doing the same thing? Why does Jason Kenney just talk about how bad, we shouldn't have to have the Emergencies Act? We'll do something about it, Jason. Actually pass a motion saying we're not going to enforce it in this province. Not happening.
I love it. Okay, let's talk about an Alberta Revenue Agency, because you've got a really novel approach here. And I want people to understand just how we would be able to essentially keep some of the transfers that we would otherwise give to Ottawa through this unfair tax and transfer scheme, we keep them here. And I'm curious to know whether or not we have the legal authority to do this, or whether if it's really being a provocation that you're proposing, it would be no problem setting up our Alberta Revenue Agency. We already have a tax administration that collects our corporate income tax. We obviously collect all sorts of other taxes. We have the capacity to collect a very complex range of royalties, fuel taxes, liquor taxes, tobacco taxes. For some reason, we're supposed to believe we don't have the capacity to collect personal income tax. But you've got a solution to that too, and I'd love for you to walk us through what you see happening here.
Well, first of all, you're absolutely right. There's no reason why we shouldn't be collecting our own taxes. Frankly, as Quebec is arguing, there's no reason why we shouldn't collect the federal taxes too and just remit the feds portion, kind of flip it around. We'll see how that goes as Quebec argues that. But I like the idea. The idea here is to say, look, if the feds are going to continue to play games with these federal transfers and continue to not come to the table and negotiate something more reasonable on equalization, well, why not collect all of the public employee federal taxes at source? Okay, so as you know, when anybody is paid from their employer, in most cases, their employer is going to withhold the federal portion of their taxes at source, the federal and provincial portion at source, and will remit that to CRA. And then at the end of the year, of course, you get your T4 and it says how much that you've paid in taxes to the federal government. And usually you get a return because you've overpaid. And that's how that all works. So what if, if a business doesn't remit those source withholdings to the CRA, they get in trouble, obviously, and they're responsible for it. So what happens if the provincial government set from all of its public employees and nurses and the police officers and teachers and all that, establishes an agency, collects all of the taxes, submits the checks to their employers, takes all of the source remittances that they collect at source, but instead of giving it to the federal portion to the CRA, give it to the provincial revenue agency, let them keep it as an offset for equalization. Now, that's going to make the feds mad because it's probably going to be found to be unconstitutional, knowing the Supreme Court's decision on that. I would say that it probably will, but there's really nothing the feds can do other than possibly retaliate and try to withhold some grants from Alberta. Well, Alberta can go a step further. Well, why not say that if again, it goes back to enforcement, why not say that all taxes in the province of Alberta collected at source are remitted to the provincial government? Now, is that going to cause a constitutional crisis? It may. And I'm not saying this is the first step at all. It's not. But it's something we have in our back pocket that we need to kind of keep there as an option so that if some of these more obvious things like the Alberta Revenue Agency, replacing the Canada Pension Plan, EI, all that stuff, if the feds won't play ball after all of that, well, there's some other things that we can do to make sure that we're not ripped off endlessly going forward.
That's a great lever. Well, and especially if you point out that we're sending $20 to $30 billion more to Ottawa than we get back in federal transfers. Even this amount is only a small portion of the amount that continues to flow the other way. Talk to me a little bit about the Canada Pension Plan, because I have been persuaded that about this issue, but I know that some of our seniors who are already receiving Canada Pension, I think they're worried that, oh my gosh, what are you talking about? Are you going to cancel my pension plan? And I wonder if there's some way that you can ease their concerns, because that's a pretty big number too, that if we were to just implement our own Alberta pension plan under our own policies, that would mean $3 billion less per year being transferred out of the province.
Yeah, that's how much we over-contribute to the. Yeah, and why not use those? First of all, that's just fear mongering with regards to seniors' pensions. The legislation, as it stands currently, allows Alberta to withdraw, and there will be a process for that, and the pensions of seniors will be protected. And if for some reason the federal government completely lost their minds and decided that they were going to not send seniors their pensions, Alberta, obviously, the government of Alberta would make up the difference and make sure that they got their pensions. But that's not what will happen. The seniors would still get their pensions, and then as we would slowly transfer over to Alberta pension plan, and what would happen for seniors at the beginning is we could take that extra $3 billion and increase benefits for them. So they get their Canadian pension, and then they'd receive a portion of what was being contributed into the Alberta pension plan by today's workers in Alberta. So it's a no-lose situation for seniors. But of course, the left, as they often do, try to they just make stuff up and try to scare people into not changing, and that works on healthcare, and it has seemed to be working on pension plan. Quebec does this, by the way, already, and Ontario actually under
Kathleen
Kathleen
Wynne.
Wynne.
Yeah.
Kathleen Wynne, they actually did a large project, a large study on exactly how they were going to do it in Ontario too, withdraw, and they didn't do it, and it was essentially for the same reasons, for political reasons, and it was because seniors were scared and so forth. But they did it, and it was also viable for Ontario as well. But it makes total sense for Alberta to do this. We should have done it decades ago.
Well, the transfer is so huge. You actually get the best of both worlds. Not only can you enhance seniors' benefits, but you can also reduce the premiums for workers as well. What about employment insurance? That one just chaps me up because I've observed over the years that we keep on paying more into employment insurance, and then when our people get a downturn in the economy, they don't have the same rich benefits they do in other parts of the country. And then there's always these surpluses that get racked up and they get stolen into general revenues. And I'm thinking, why would we do this? But you've quantified the amount of extra that we pay, and that's $2 billion a year. That's a huge amount of money.
No, it's totally huge. And it's like you said, this one, instead of giving the extra to beneficiaries, what we might do with this is decrease the premiums that our workers pay. We can, $2 billion is a lot of money. We can use it in many different ways, but why on earth are we sending it to other jurisdictions in the country and not spending it here in Alberta? So that's another $2 billion in the pot. And, I list 4.5 billion, 3 billion, 2 billion to give you an idea here. That's the public employee federal tax at source. That idea would save 4.5 billion. If you expanded it to the private sector, it'd be 3 to 4 times that number.
Wow.
So the numbers do start to add up the more dramatic the steps you take. And you don't, of course, start with the most dramatic step. You start with the Alberta Revenue Agency, the pension plan, employment insurance, and see if Ottawa gets the message and changes.
I love it. Okay, so we've talked about a lot of your strategy, the Alberta Sovereignty Act, the Equalization, Termination, and Tax Collection Act. So I think that this combination of strategies here would ultimately terminate the amount of equalization we pay. We've talked, I think, as well about opting out of the healthcare, education, all of the other ways in which they interfere with our jurisdiction, CPP and EI. But you also want to dip your toe into an area of federal jurisdiction and take some sovereignty over that too, which are with judicial appointments and negotiating international trade. Let's deal with those in two pieces. So first of all, talk to me about negotiating international trade agreements, because that's one area where I get the impression that both the federal government under Stephen Harper and under the Liberals, they did not a bad job. They had the European Trade Agreement, they had the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It seems like that may be the one area where they're in sync, that we need to have more globalized trade. Although in this world where supply chains are screwed up, maybe it's turned things upside down. What role do you think Alberta should play in developing its own bilateral agreements, and why?
Well, I think, and again, Quebec's been our example in this. They've been sending their own delegation to these various international conferences and negotiations for for years. It's not new to them. But essentially, I think if we're going to assert our sovereignty here as a province, we have to back that up, and that means that when we go to, for example, as much as I don't want to go to, the new, COP20 whatever, and talk about these some of the ridiculous policies that they talk about there. We need to send a delegation, and we need to make it clear to folks there that like when they come up with these harebrained ideas, and somebody from Canada says, like Stephen Guilbeault stands up and tells the world, we're going to shut down all fossil fuel use in Canada by 2030. Well, the Alberta delegation needs to be able to say, well, no, we're not, because we're not going to enforce it. Sorry.
Just that simple.
Yeah, just that simple. Of course, that's going to undermine the feds, and they're going to be furious with it. But too bad. We need to be there. We need to explain the reason why. We explain, because that's a silly way of doing it. We're working on carbon neutrality here or net zero by doing X, Y, and Z, and we can have that discussion and so forth. We got to make our case. We can't be on the sidelines anymore, and that's the same for trade agreements, for pipeline agreements, for all of the things that we do here. We're happy to let the feds take the lead, but we're going to be there. And if they jerk us around, we're going to make it clear that that's not Alberta's position. And since we hold all the levers of enforcement in our province, That's not going to happen here.
Maybe I should ask you this. It's not really a trade agreement, but it is an international partnership. And I've often wondered, because I keep getting asked this from our dear friends who are unvaccinated, who are still not able to cross the border, or still not able to get on an airplane. Is there any way that we could develop a bilateral agreement with the red states, the free states? So you call up Ron DeSantis and say, hey, do you think we'd be able to allow for charter flights to go to your state so that people can travel back and forth, or do the same thing with Texas and South Dakota and some of the other American states that have the same ethic and attitude that a lot of our residents do here? Would we even have the ability to do that?
Good question. And the reason I am
worth trying. Hey,
let me be careful what I say, but wouldn't it be nice to have control over our own airports? Wouldn't it be nice to have control over our own border crossings? For me, everything's on the table. Alberta is Alberta. We are a sovereign nation within a nation, as far as I'm concerned. I don't think people want to be governed here by bureaucrats and politicians in Ottawa any longer. And I love those ideas. They don't make it in here because people hear it and they're like, "Oh, how is that possible?" But really think about it. What right does Ottawa have to tell us who lands at our airports, who comes to our borders? We have to have these discussions. And right now, those are obviously issues where the Constitution says that the feds do have that power, but we also have all the enforcement powers. And if we want to change that, they've certainly changed a lot of the deal. Maybe we need to start thinking on that front. I mean, immigration policy, Quebec already controls their own immigration policy. That's federal. So that changed. So if that's the case, let's control our own immigration policy. And that necessarily means controlling our borders and controlling our airports.
Wouldn't it be interesting to see that happen? All right, let me talk to you about this last one about the judicial appointments. And I think you've mentioned that why control our own judicial appointments? Why not? Have you ever considered whether some of our judges should be elected? I'm open to the conversation about it. I like the idea of having an independent judiciary that isn't subject to the vagaries of elections. But then again, you can also elect somebody on a 10-year mandate so that they don't feel like they have to constantly be campaigning. It just feels to me like once somebody gets appointed to that august office, that we lose any kind of accountability to the public. And maybe that's just a personal frustration that I've seen with judicial activism, but you've identified it as one area that we need to assert our independence. Tell me what your concerns are and how you think we change that.
Well, we've been really lucky here in Alberta. We have a very good judiciary, frankly. They're very qualified. Their appointment process to this point in time has largely been very apolitical, very unpolitical. We're lucky. We have a good bench, both at the appeal level and at the provincial level and at the QB level. The issue we have now is, if you've been watching the news, is the politicization of judicial appointments. It used to be very much that you'd have, the various law societies would submit names of qualified individuals who were kind of like the cream of the crop of the lawyers practicing in certain areas. And then the feds, they really didn't care what party they belonged to. And generally, they probably didn't belong to any party. And they would be appointed based on merit primarily. There's always exceptions, of course, no system's perfect, but it's worked really well. But over the last several years, and of course, this doesn't apply to every appointment, but the news, the various reports from various news outlets, a lot of them left-leaning, so it's have made it very clear that it's become extremely hyper partisan. That they are literally only looking for candidates now for the federal bench that are members of the Liberal Party or have been members of the Liberal Party, have spoken out on various issues that are important to the Liberal Party. They're looking for Liberal activists to fill those positions. And that's a disaster. That's worse than elected judges, which is also, in my view, not a good thing for various reasons, mainly that the scales of justice should be completely independent of anything. It shouldn't be about getting elected. It should be just about making the right decision based on what the law is and so forth. But I think Alberta needs to take control of its judicial system going forward. I'm not saying change the judges that are there, but on a go forward, let's appoint our own QB judges. Let's appoint our own appeal judges. Let's do that in here. And let's find a system that is more accountable. I like the way they do it in the States, not the elected part. I like the way that they do the Supreme Court appointments, where you have that that vetting at the front end, make sure that they're qualified, make sure that they're not overly biased, et cetera, et cetera. Most of them get through, some of them don't because they're probably not qualified. And then once they're on the bench, then let them do their job.
Well, that's the thing that's ridiculous, isn't it? Is we probably could name more U.S. Supreme Court justices because we watch it with every single confirmation hearing, and I bet people would be hard pressed to name any of the Supreme Court judges in Canada. I like Russell Brown as a for instance. I think he was the dissenting judge in the carbon tax case, but I met him years ago. I know he's a staunch property rights advocate, so I was cheering when I knew that he got appointed. But I couldn't name the other ones really, or their particular political persuasion. But what strikes me about your strategy, because I spoke with Gord Tulk last week, and his strategy is centered around reforming some of our federal institutions. You don't talk about how we get a fair number of House of Commons seats or a fair number of Senate seats, or how we get a better appointment process at the Supreme Court level, because Quebec has 3 appointed judges at the federal level out of 9. And it's so obvious when you look at the federal structure that it makes no sense for the situation we find ourselves in. But why not talk about some of those federal reforms? Is it just a lost cause?
I think it is a bit of a lost cause, but that's not to say we shouldn't keep fighting. We should always advocate for what's right. And maybe when we have better leverage as a province and as multiple provinces, Saskatchewan, Alberta, et cetera, maybe we'll actually be able to see some of those reforms, Triple E Senate and so forth. But right now it is a lost cause because Ottawa laughs at us every time we bring it up. And the reason they do is because we've done absolutely precisely jack squat to assert our provincial autonomy and our provincial sovereignty within Canada, and we need to do that. And so until that happens, I'm just going to stick to what we can control here in Alberta, and let people who want to write books about what needs to change federally. God bless them. I wish them the best of luck, but it's a long road.
It's interesting. I was trying to look for this email because you probably also get emailed and phone called 2 or 3 times a day from the premier because there's a vote coming up. But I saw one where one of the reasons why it was suggested, I think it was Jackie Lovely doing this email saying the premier is really fighting hard for you. He's fighting hard against Ottawa, and I find that interesting because it seems like I'm hearing the opposite when I go travel around the province. One of the great frustrations is that we got a very strong mandate in the equalization referendum, and there doesn't seem to be any action to execute on that. And I wonder if you've got some thoughts on why that would be. It seems like everything that you've put forward, as you said, we don't need Ottawa's permission to do any of this. These are policies that with political will, you could either give the notification for the period of time that you need to, so that it takes the 1 or 2 or 3 years to do the transition, or you could start it immediately. So why not do that? What do you think is going on?
I don't, that whole equalization vote, and I felt, bad saying it at the time, but I did say it at the time that this is just symbolic. I mean, this is not going to do anything. And the reason is because there's no enforcement mechanism. Sound familiar? There's no enforcement mechanism on the other side. Like, what are you going to do? Like, who cares? Like, do you think Justin Trudeau sits around and says, oh man, 58% of Albertans say we need to change equalization. Well, we better do that. Like, no.
No, what he said was, oh, you want an equalization referendum? Here's my answer to it. Here's Stephen Guilbeault, and he now wants to phase out your industry. That was his answer.
That was exactly. It was the exact opposite of what we tried to do, what we were trying to achieve. So, like, to me, it's just that's just politics. And I am totally tired of doing things like buying billboards and holding referendums that mean nothing on these things, wasting time and effort on that. Let's get down to business and let's do like the Alberta Revenue Agency, get her done. That could be done tomorrow. Get the police force transition, get the RCMP to stick to federal issues and let all the provincial policing be here. The CPP, the Alberta Sovereignty Act could be done tomorrow. I mean, Premier Kenney's a federalist at the end of the day. He's from Ontario. People think, oh, he's from Alberta. No, he's not. I mean, his political career was Alberta when he came over with taxpayers and so forth. But he's from Ontario. He is a devout federalist, and that's fine. But that's not someone that is going to change the status quo. That is someone that wants to be seen as part of the the federal elite that's protecting the integrity of the nation and so forth. He's not going to make these big decisions. We need to make sure that our leaders in the future, whoever that is, and whether it's Jason Kenney now or Jason Kenney, whether he leaves now or after the next election or whenever, that his replacement, whoever that may be, maybe I'm looking at her right now, but
or maybe I'm looking at him right now.
I don't know. But anyway, we got to make sure that person is committed to these principles. So that's what we're trying to do.
The problem with not being aggressive in advancing some of these is that now we've seen that there's been an equal and opposite reaction. I've been traveling, as I mentioned, in rural Alberta, and the RCMP union has done a full court press to try to convince the rural municipalities not to do this. In fact, I think that most municipalities have passed motions saying they do not want an Alberta provincial police, which is kind of bananas, I would think. Why wouldn't you want additional options for enforcement? I mean, why not give people the option? If you want to keep your RCMP as your local community policing, fair enough, but there's lots of communities that want to do something different. Maybe we need to have an Alberta provincial police to replace the sheriffs, just to give a more robust type of training and policing to that level of service. I just find it amazing that we now have the federal government or the federal union kind of reverting to lining up the municipalities in order to work against our sovereign interests. And I guess that's why I would like to see some more robust action, because what I was told is that all of this work was being done to convince people to keep the RCMP, but there wasn't really any work done on the other side to explain what you have so well, that enforcement is key if you want to actually start putting some of these principles in place.
Yeah, no, and we're going to be trying to get across the province to talk to especially rural areas who have the most reservations about it, because they're being scared by these advertising campaigns, to explain. I mean, how amazing would it be if an Alberta child, boy or girl, could grow up in their community into a young man, young woman, and then have all those relationships in rural Alberta that's so great, so wonderful, and then be able to stay in that community. They know the people, they know how to deal with certain people, and they could stay there and police and have a career in the place that they grew up. We don't have that option with the RCMP. We need to have it. And so just that alone is a reason to do it. But also, when the feds pass laws that attack our people, like the Emergencies Act, for example, we need to be able to tell our police force that is not being enforced, because under the Alberta Sovereignty Act, we will not enforce it here. Therefore, you are obligated not to enforce it here. And we need to look at it that way, I think.
So talk to me about what you think happens May 18th, because I think if the Premier had given some consideration to your proposal and started implementing some of the items in it, I think that would have gone a long way to winning over some of the frustrated folks in rural Alberta. That's where it seems a lot of the pushback is. What do you anticipate would happen after May 18th? Because you and I put a lot on the line for our first failed attempt at unity, but I think you and I were both cheering along the Brian Jean and Jason Kenney when they did the second run and created the United Conservative Party. But I'm seeing that there's the potential for Brian to split off again, and for Drew Barnes to create a rural-only party, and for Paul Hinman, who was also a Jason Kenney supporter. He's gone back to rejuvenate the Wild Rose, and even Todd Loewen is keeping his options open in case the Premier stays. He may start a new party. I don't know if this movement can stay together if we don't start acting on some of the things that you've put on the table.
Yeah, I agree. I think that this is something that that the Premier has really lost an opportunity here, because this is a unifying issue for the Conservative movement. I think the vast majority of people would agree with 80% of what's being advocated in this proposal. But I agree with you, Danielle. I've been through the Civil War once, and still have the scars, as do you. And I don't. Our province is not like it was 20 years ago. Even we cannot split the Conservative vote and expect to form any kind of government. It just won't happen. So now, granted, if a party continues to be led down a poor path, the Conservative Party is continued to be led by an ineffectual leader, then at some point there's going to be another party that comes along and replaces that party. And there's going to be pain. That's usually going to mean a left-wing party is in power for 48 years because of that. But that may be what happens. But I I would just encourage people to try to work from within as much as possible. But I understand the frustration. I mean, some of the things that come out of the Premier's mouth, just I don't even know what to say sometimes, especially on some of these civil liberties issues and provincial rights issues. But we'll see what happens on the 18th. I'm crossing my fingers.
So let's talk then about next steps. You're going to be traveling across the province. I know that you've been doing Zoom calls because sort of the nature of what we've been experiencing since you wrote your strategy is the on and the off again of being able to host live events, especially with people who didn't qualify under the restriction exemption program. So tell me what the next step is if we continue on keeping the economy open, not having the kind of restrictions. That gives you a lot more freedom over the summer to be visiting communities. When is the Free Alberta Strategy coming to a community near you?
Well, we'll still probably use the Zoom technology as much as we can because it's been so effective and it's such a big province and I have a day job. So it's kind of hard to swing out to Lac La Biche for the day. But anyway, so we'll continue to use that. But yes, we are planning some events in Calgary and Edmonton and Central Alberta in particular. And we're just gonna the big thing we're going to be doing right now. We've kind of taken a pause because we want to see what happens on the 18th, because we want to make sure that if there is a leadership vote, that one way or another we're very involved in having a say on who that next leader is and what issues they're advocating for in their platform. So we're kind of taking a breather right now and waiting on that and kind of just getting ready for what's hopefully going to be a pretty crazy summer.
Well, then let's talk it out on two levels. So if there is a new leadership contest, I think your timing is perfect to put all of these issues on the table. And you've already got endorsements from a number of people who might be in the race, but certainly would be in caucus wanting to see these kinds of ideas implemented. So that would be great. But if there isn't, you and I have talked before about this new Wild Rose inspired legislation. One of them is recall, and Paul Hinman must be delighted that at least there's some legislation on the book for recall, because that was one of the things he felt was most important to hold legislated individuals to account in between elections. But the other is this citizen initiative. And I've been waiting for this to get passed for 2 years. The bar is really high. You have to get 300,000 signatures to get any idea put forward in a sort of a petition so that it would be considered by the legislature. And then it sounds like a legislative committee determines whether they're going to pass it forward in the legislature or put it to the people in a referendum. But at least there's a process. Have you had a chance to look at that legislation? Do you think that there's an avenue there to get some of your ideas pushed forward through that means if we don't have politicians who are going to act on their own?
I think so. I think that the approach to, first of all, I don't think any of these proposals, this is not a vote on separation, and I don't think any of them require a referendum. I don't think they should. I think a premier that's run on this platform going into a provincial election and has succeeded in that provincial election has all the authority he or she would need to pass these pieces. However, as you note, if for example, Jason Kenney were to remain in power and after the 18th and he continued, perhaps there would be an effort by some people to say, okay, these are the things that we want done over the next little while. And if you're still refusing in that regard, or if Rachel Notley got in and she didn't want to do any of these proposals, then I think that would be the time, exactly as you say, for a citizen initiative legislation to be utilized in the way that you're talking about, and get some of these things. And my only caution with that is that you'd want to make sure that all of us, because there's many, I think, groups that advocate for some of these policies, that everyone is working together very closely to make sure it's successful, because the cause could be set back quite a few years if we if something was on the ballot and it didn't succeed.
It's a good point, because you need 60 days to get 300,000 signatures. And if it fails, you can't even try again for another 5 years. So
there you go.
Yeah. So I totally take your point on that. Rob Anderson, thank you so much for the work that you've done on this. I think it's a really important conversation to have right now. How do you feel about the level of traction that it's getting? Because you're quite right. I've talked about the Alberta Prosperity Project. There's Take Back Alberta. There's, I think, literally dozens and dozens of of freedom groups out there wanting to have a change. It feels to me like there's some momentum behind this.
Yeah, I believe so, and you've been a huge advocate everywhere you've gone on this. But we're starting to work a little bit with the Alberta Prosperity Project. We've got some joint speaking events there that maybe I'll see you at a couple of them. But we want to try to get it through there because we want to try to convince our folks that are kind of in the separatist camp to maybe come back and try this one last time, see if they can get behind this. So we're going to be working with them. We're obviously working with the Alberta Institute, Project Confederation. We're working with these groups as well to get this implemented, because these are not things we don't need to have. These organizations shouldn't be working against each other. They should be working with one another. And if we, whether it's to get a leader in place that believes in these things and is going to implement these things, these reforms, or if it's to work together to get a successful citizen initiative put together, I think that's great. So that's what we're going to be doing. I think it's getting a lot of traction, but obviously there's still hours and hundreds of hours of more work to be done.
Well, and perfect timing too. So I'll be in touch with you on May the 19th. We'll see if we can work together on a strategy.
Sounds
Rob
good.
Anderson, thanks so much for the work you do. I sure appreciate it.
Thanks, Danielle. Take care.
You got it. That was Rob Anderson. He is the co-author of the Free Alberta Strategy. I'm wondering if I can just share. I want to do one last share screen on the strategy so that you can see the document. I think this is it. Yes, you want to see the website. So if you go to their website, freealbertastrategy.com, you can read the full strategy online. There's a way that you can sign up for updates, as you've been able to see as well. They have already got 100,000 people who are involved in this. You can find out what the events are. You can see news. You can see this petition, and you'll be able to see some of the upcoming events that they're going to have coming up over the next couple of months. And so, as they said, everybody is kind of in this holding pattern right now, waiting to see what happens on May the 18th. I'd be very interested in hearing your thoughts on this strategy. You can always send me an email to danielle@daniellesmith.ca. We will be back at it for our short form on Monday, and we'll do another long form interview next week. Thanks so much for tuning in. I'm Danielle Smith. This has been The Danielle Smith Show.